All right, so are you ready to like really get into it today? We're doing a deep dive on this book, Don't Believe Everything You Think. It's by Joseph Nguyen.
Yeah, it's all about how to quiet your mind, find some more peace and happiness and all that good stuff. And we got excerpts from the intro chapter.
Even the acknowledgments, right?
Oh, yeah, we're going deep.
Gotta love a good acknowledgement section. Okay, so this deep dive, it's all about giving our listeners the practical tools, the exercises, the how-to from Nguyen so they can actually use this stuff to reduce suffering in their lives. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, totally. And he really gets into this idea of feeling the insights, not just like understanding them intellectually.
Right, like it's not just another self-help book to add to your to-do list.
Exactly. And that emphasis on feeling, it's huge because it all comes back to his main point, right? That thinking, a lot of times, that's the root of suffering.
Okay, so when you say thinking, is he talking about like all thinking?
Well,
or is it more specific than that?
Good question. He makes a distinction between like thoughts just kind of popping into your head, which happens to everyone.
Yeah, all the time.
And then actually thinking, like actively engaging with those thoughts, especially the negative ones, getting stuck on them,
For sure. It's like that monkey mind, right?
Yeah.
Swinging from one anxious thought to the next, never slowing down.
Yeah, totally. And Nguyen, he has this great analogy he uses. The thought meter.
The what meter?
The thoughtometer. Imagine like a gauge in your mind.
Okay, got it.
And the more you're stewing over thoughts, the higher that needle climbs into the red. And that's where you get that stress, that anger, that overwhelm.
Oh, tell me about it. Just this morning, I was running late, couldn't find my keys, spilled coffee on my shirt. It's like my thoughtometer was redlining before I even left the house.
And that's exactly what he's saying. We don't have to live like that. Our natural state, he argues, it's actually peace, it's love, it's joy, it's the overthinking that kind of blocks us off from that.
So we're not talking about becoming emotionless robots here.
No, not at all. He even talks about how athletes, when they get in the zone, that flow state.
Like Mushin.
Exactly. They're not thinking. It's more like they're not overthinking. They're fully present, not stuck in their heads.
So then how do we tap into that zone in our own lives? When it feels like there's always something to overthink about.
Well, Nguyen, he has this exercise in the book where he asks you to think about your dream income.
Got it.
Multiply it by 5. What happens?
Well, suddenly it feels a lot less attainable. Like my brain goes from, yeah, that'd be nice, to, wait, how is that even possible? Like it's almost too big to even comprehend.
Exactly. And that's his point. Even something positive, like a massive pay raise, it can trigger that scarcity mindset, those never enough thoughts, just because of how our minds are wired.
So it's not about the money itself, it's about our thoughts about it.
Exactly. And that's why he talks about setting goals from inspiration, not from a place of desperation. When we're really aligned with something we want, it feels effortless, it feels exciting, not like this constant uphill battle.
Which kind of reminds me of how he talks about McKenna, his girlfriend. He uses their relationship as an example of unconditional love, which sounds amazing in theory, but like, how does that actually work in real life?
It's a really powerful concept. Nguyen describes her love as this pure, ever-present thing, no strings attached. It just is.
Okay, so it's like, I love you because you just are, not I love you because.
Exactly. And he connects this to intuition, which he describes as our own internal GPS that's always guiding us towards our best selves.
It's like that little voice inside that says, go for it, or maybe not.
Exactly. But just like all that overthinking can drown out that inner wisdom, our intuition.
And it can be hard to hear that little voice sometimes, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. He even talks about how people like Edison and Einstein, they had their own methods for quieting their minds and making space for those breakthroughs. It wasn't about forcing it. It was about creating the space for it to come through.
So you're not talking about like emptying your mind completely.
Yeah.
It's more about being intentional about what we allow to take up space in there.
You got it. And the good news is he actually gives us practical steps to do that, like identifying your thinking triggers, changing habits. There are even journaling prompts in the book. It's about awareness and then making different choices.
Okay, so it's like we're not just talking about some vague feel-good stuff here. He actually gives you the tools to put this into practice, right?
Absolutely. And it all goes back to these 3 principles he talks about: mind, consciousness, and thought, and how they work together to create our reality.
Okay, can you break those down for me?
Yeah.
Because I think I need a little refresher on those.
Yeah, so think of universal mind like pure potentiality, pure creative energy. It connects everything. It's like electricity. You can't see electricity itself.
Right.
But you can see its effects everywhere.
Right. It's like this invisible force that's always there, even when we don't see it or acknowledge it.
Right. And our consciousness, that's our awareness. It's what allows us to experience this energy, to even know we exist. It's how we're aware of our thoughts and feelings.
Like the light bulb that allows us to actually see because of that electricity.
Exactly. I like that. Okay. And then thought, that's what we're actually aware of in each moment, constantly changing like channels on a TV.
Okay, so
Well,
if we're always plugged into this universal mind, this source of peace and joy, why aren't we feeling it all the time? What's the deal with all the suffering?
that is the question, isn't it? And Nguyen's answer is pretty simple, actually. It's our thinking. When we get caught up in our thoughts, especially the negative ones, we block ourselves off from that connection to universal mind.
It's not that the peace and joy disappear. It's more like we build walls with our thinking that keep us from experiencing them.
You got it. He actually says that thinking is like this primal survival mechanism that helped us evolve. You know, our minds are constantly scanning for danger, trying to predict threats based on past experiences, which is why we feel all that fear and anxiety sometimes. It helped our ancestors avoid getting eaten by saber-toothed tigers.
Uh-huh.
But it's not so helpful when we're just trying to decide what to have for dinner.
I love that. Our brains haven't quite caught up to the fact that most of us aren't in life or death situations on a daily basis.
Exactly. But the good news is we don't have to be victims of our own minds. Just because a thought pops up doesn't mean we have to believe it or let it control us.
Okay, I love that. So how do we actually do that? How do we stop our minds from taking us down that rabbit hole of negativity and worry?
Well, that's what's so great about Nguyen's approach. He gives us practical tools and techniques we can start using today.
All right, let's hear it. What's step one?
One of the most important things, and he really emphasizes this, is understanding the difference between thoughts and thinking, which we touched on earlier, but it's worth repeating because it's so easy to get them confused.
Right, because understanding the difference is key to actually changing how we relate to those thoughts.
Absolutely. It's like thoughts are like those notifications that pop up on your phone. They just appear. But thinking is when you pick up the phone, start scrolling, and get sucked into that notification.
Okay, that's a really helpful visual. So how do we start to notice when we're doing that? The scrolling, not just the notification. How do we catch ourselves in the act?
He says, pay attention to your emotions. Negative emotions especially are often a sign that you're letting your thoughts run the show.
So if I'm feeling anxious, stressed, frustrated, that's a good indicator that I'm too deep in my head, churning over those thoughts instead of just letting them pass through.
Exactly. It's like that thought-o-meter we talked about. The higher that needle climbs, the more those negative emotions start to take over.
Okay, so the key is to catch those feelings early on and then ask, what am I thinking right now that's causing me to feel this way? Like, what's making my thought-o-meter redline?
Exactly. That simple awareness can be so powerful. It lets you step back and see the thought for what it is. Just a thought, not necessarily truth. You don't have to believe everything you think.
It's not about pretending the thought isn't there. It's about choosing not to let it have power over us.
Exactly. Think of thoughts like clouds. They come and go. We don't try to stop the clouds. We just acknowledge them and let them drift by.
I love that. So we don't have to be perfect at this. It's a practice.
That's right. And another important practice Nguyen talks about is creating space. And that can be literal space, like in our environment and our schedules, but also figurative space in our minds.
Okay, so like decluttering our homes and our calendars. And then what about our minds? What does that look like?
It's about making choices that eliminate things that stress you out and trigger those negative thought spirals.
So that could look like saying no more often, setting better boundaries at work, maybe finally tackling that pile of laundry that's been staring me down for a week.
You got it. It's about being intentional with your time and energy so you can create more space for peace and clarity.
It's about prioritizing your own well-being, which I'll admit can sometimes feel selfish.
And this is where Nguyen challenges that notion. He says, when you prioritize your own well-being, you actually show up better in all areas of your life.
It's like they say, you can't pour from an empty cup.
I love that.
Speaking of filling our cups, Nguyen also has some really interesting things to say about how this idea of non-thinking, this quieting the mind, can actually help us achieve our goals more effectively.
Absolutely. He argues that most of us set goals from a place of desperation, not inspiration.
It's like we're always on this treadmill, constantly chasing after the next thing, never feeling satisfied in the present moment.
Right. And that's no way to live. He says that when we tap into non-thinking, when we get out of our own way, we open ourselves up to a world of possibilities. Things start flowing effortlessly, almost like magic.
Okay, tell me more about this magic. How does that actually work?
Well, it goes back to those three principles. When we quiet our minds, we create space for universal intelligence to work through us.
So it's like we become conduits for that creative energy, that infinite potential, instead of trying to control everything with our limited human minds.
Exactly. We start attracting the right opportunities, the right people, the right resources without even trying so hard.
I am here for that.
Yeah.
So how do we actually make that shift from setting goals from a place of I have to a place of I get to, from desperation to inspiration?
He has this great question he asks. When setting a goal, ask yourself, am I doing this because I feel like I have to or because I truly want to?
Wow, what a powerful question, and one that requires a lot of honesty with ourselves.
It does. It's so easy to get caught up in what we think we should be doing, instead of what truly lights us up.
Right, like what we think will make us happy versus what actually brings us joy.
And that's the key difference. He says true happiness, it comes from aligning with our authentic selves.
So it's not about giving up on goals altogether. It's about setting goals that feel good, that feel aligned with our values and our purpose.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we're decluttering. We're starting to notice the difference between thoughts and thinking. We're setting goals from a place of inspiration. What else can we do to invite more peace and joy into our lives?
This is where he introduces one of the most, I think, profound concepts in the book, unconditional love.
Ah, yes, the McKenna chapter. I was so curious to hear more about this. So how does unconditional love fit into all of this?
He says that unconditional love, it's actually our natural state. It's who we are at our core. But just like our thinking can cloud our experience of peace and joy, it can also block us from giving and receiving love fully.
Okay, so we put conditions on our love. We say, I'll love you if, or I'll love myself when.
Exactly. And those conditions create separation. Not just from other people, but from ourselves.
We withhold love based on these arbitrary standards and expectations.
And that creates so much unnecessary suffering.
Yes. It's exhausting. Always judging ourselves, comparing ourselves. It's like we're setting ourselves up for failure.
Exactly. He says that when you tap into unconditional love within, we free ourselves from all that. And that's where we experience true peace and joy.
Okay, I love this idea. But it also feels kind of, I don't know, abstract. How do you actually cultivate unconditional love in a practical, tangible way?
Well, he tells this really sweet story about McKenna. He asks her why she loves him, and she says, I don't know, I just do. And at first, he's a little taken aback because he's used to overthinking everything,
Right.
But then he realizes that her response, it wasn't about a lack of reasons. It was actually a testament to how pure and deep her love was. It just was.
It wasn't based on anything he did or didn't do. Wow. That's powerful.
Right. And it was so freeing for him to realize that love doesn't need a reason. It doesn't need to be earned. It just is.
But how do we apply that to our own lives?
Yeah.
It's one thing to understand it intellectually, but how do we actually experience that kind of unconditional love?
He says it starts with the most important relationship we have, the one with ourselves.
Self-love. Everyone's talking about self-love these days.
Ah.
But what does that actually look like in practice?
It's about recognizing your inherent worthiness, flaws and all, quieting that inner critic and treating yourself with kindness, like you would a loved one.
So it's about accepting all parts of ourselves, even the messy parts, the parts we want to hide.
Exactly. It's about embracing our wholeness. And when we do that for ourselves, it becomes so much easier to extend that same love and acceptance to others.
It's like they say, hurt people, hurt people. Healed people, heal people.
Yes. And when we're coming from that place of wholeness, of unconditional self-love, we naturally become more patient, more understanding, more forgiving, not just with ourselves, but with everyone around us.
So we're quieting the mind, setting goals from inspiration, and cultivating unconditional love, starting with ourselves. It all sounds pretty amazing.
Yeah.
But are there any, challenges we should be prepared for? Anything Nguyen warns us about?
He talks about the importance of learning to trust our intuition, which he describes as our inner GPS.
Intuition, that gut feeling. Got it.
Exactly. And he says that our intuition often guides us towards those unknown paths, the ones that scare us a little bit. But it takes practice to discern between what our gut is telling us versus just our fears disguised as intuition.
So how do we know when it's our intuition speaking and not just our own insecurities? Especially when it comes to making big decisions.
He says to pay attention to how it feels. Does it feel expansive, exciting, aligned with your deepest desires? Or does it feel constricting, fear-based?
So if it feels good, it's probably my intuition. If it feels icky, maybe not so much.
Exactly. But like with anything else, it takes practice. The more we use our intuition, the stronger it becomes.
So it's like we have this internal compass that's always pointing us in the right direction. We just have to remember to check it and then actually trust what it's telling us.
Exactly. It's about reclaiming your power.
Wow.
Trusting that you are guided and supported and that you have everything you need within you to create a life you love.
It all starts with that one simple yet profound realization. Not believing everything you think.
That's it.
It's like we're giving ourselves permission to actually listen to that inner wisdom, the one we've maybe been ignoring because it seems too simple.
It's funny how we do that, overcomplicate things. But yeah, and Nguyen's all about that simplicity.
Okay, so we're getting better at spotting those thoughts, creating some breathing room in our lives, and even tuning into our intuition a little more. But what about when things get tough, inevitably? Life throws a curveball and those negative thoughts just won't quit. What do we do then?
Well, this is where I think one of his most powerful ideas comes in. Nothing is good or bad, but thinking makes it so.
He got that from Shakespeare.
He did. But it's such a good reminder.
It's not the situation itself that's causing us to suffer. It's our thoughts about it.
Exactly. He uses this great analogy with a piano.
Oh, I love his analogies.
Right. So he says there are 88 keys, black and white, but none of them are inherently wrong.
Okay, I'm following.
It's only when we decide to play a particular song, when we have a certain melody in mind, that some keys become right or wrong within that context.
So we're not trying to control everything that happens to us, because let's be honest, we can't control everything.
Definitely not.
But we can control how we think about those events, how we choose to interpret them.
Exactly. It's like we can't always choose what happens to us, but we can always choose how we respond.
It's about taking a step back, observing those thoughts, but not getting swept up in them, and then choosing to focus on what empowers us rather than what drags us down.
You got it. And that's why this idea of quieting the mind, even just a little bit, is so important. It gives us that space to find new perspectives, to see things differently. Often the answers we're searching for are already within us, but our own thoughts are blocking the way.
It's like clearing out the clutter so new, fresh, more inspiring thoughts can come through.
Exactly. And he even talks about welcoming those negative thoughts with love and then letting them go.
Wait, hold on. Welcoming negative thoughts with love. How does that work? Why would we want to do that?
It's not about agreeing with them. It's about realizing those thoughts. They're just thoughts. They're not necessarily the truth. And a lot of times those negative thoughts are coming from a place of fear,
Right.
So when we approach them with a little more understanding, a little compassion, it helps us to let go of their hold on us.
So it's more like, hey, thought, I see you, but I'm not going to let you run the show anymore.
Exactly. You have a choice. You don't have to buy into every thought that pops into your head.
I like that. And the more we do that, the easier it becomes to choose the thoughts that empower us.
Absolutely. It's like building a muscle.
So speaking of challenges, what about making big life decisions? The kind where you're at a crossroads and not sure which way to go. How do we know what to do then?
That's where he really leans into trusting your intuition, that inner guidance system we've been talking about.
Right, but that can be easier said than done. It's not always clear what's our gut and what's just our anxieties talking.
Definitely. It takes practice. But he says, true intuition, it often feels expansive. It feels exciting, like it's aligned with your truest self, not coming from a place of fear.
So it's less about logic and more about just that deep down feeling, like something feels right, even if you can't quite explain it yet.
Exactly. And a lot of times it comes with this feeling of peace or clarity, maybe even a little excitement. You might actually feel it in your body, too.
Oh, that's interesting. Like a physical sensation.
Yeah, like a flutter in your chest or a feeling of lightness. Those can be good indicators.
Okay, I like that. Looking for those physical cues. So how do we get better at tapping into that, strengthening that intuition muscle?
Like anything else, the more you use it, the stronger it gets. But it starts with creating space for it to come through.
Right, like how we talked about with our homes and calendars. But how do you create space for intuition exactly?
This time, it's about creating space in your mind. Quiet, the mental chatter, those racing thoughts. Step away from distractions. Spend some time reflecting.
So that could look like meditation, spending time in nature, even just like sitting quietly for a few minutes each day.
Exactly. Create those pockets of stillness and your intuition will have more room to make itself known. It's always there, but we have to be willing to listen.
It's like when you're in a loud room, it's hard to hear anything. But step outside into the quiet and suddenly you notice all these subtle sounds you couldn't hear before.
I love that analogy. That's perfect.
Okay, so let's say we're doing all the things. We're quieting our minds, creating space. We're starting to feel those intuitive nudges. But what about when fear inevitably creeps in? Because it's so easy to let fear stop us from actually taking action, even when it feels right.
Oh, absolutely. Fear is totally normal, especially when we're moving into uncharted territory. And remember, Nguyen talks about how intuition often lives in that unknown space, which can be exciting, but also scary.
So it's not about trying to get rid of fear completely, because that's probably impossible. It's more about learning to work with it.
Exactly. He even talks about reframing fear as excitement. Like, fear can actually be a sign that you're on the right path, that you're growing.
Instead of what if it goes wrong, it's what if it goes right.
Yes. Focus on the positive potential, not the what ifs.
Okay, so we're managing our thoughts, creating space, tuning into our intuition. We're even becoming friends with fear. It's a lot. But let's be real. We're human, right? We're going to mess up, fall back into old patterns, forget all this amazing stuff we're learning. What does he say about those inevitable slip-ups?
He's big on reminding us that this is a journey. It's not like you arrive at some destination and you're done. There are going to be ups and downs, moments of clarity, and moments where you're like, what was I even doing? The key is just to keep practicing, keep coming back to these principles.
So it's not about perfection, it's about persistence.
You got it. Be kind to yourself. You're a work in progress. We all are.
That is reassuring to hear. It takes the pressure off. We don't have to have it all figured out. We just have to keep showing up.
And he reminds us that we are always, always, ever only one thought or one insight away from experiencing more peace, more joy. Sometimes that's all it takes. One shift in thinking, one aha moment. It's pretty wild when you think about it, how one little thought shift can make such a huge difference. It reminds me of what Nguyen says about those aha moments, you know, those sudden bursts of insight that can change everything. And he says we can actually create the conditions for those to happen more often.
Okay, now that sounds interesting. Like we're talking about hacking our brains for happiness here, right?
Yeah.
Tell me more.
Yeah, kind of. He even uses those famous thinkers as examples, like, Thomas Edison.
Yeah.
Or Einstein.
Yeah.
And how they didn't just think harder to solve problems, they actually made space for those breakthroughs to come through.
Right. Like Edison in those steel balls he used to fall asleep holding.
Yeah.
So he'd wake up in that kind of in-between state, and his mind would be primed for new ideas.
Yeah.
And Einstein, he was all about letting his mind wander.
Exactly. They got that forcing, it wasn't the answer. They had to create a vacuum, for those aha moments to rush in.
And that's what Nguyen's getting at with all this,
Yeah.
right? Creating that inner space, that quiet, so those intuitive insights can reach us.
Exactly. He even calls them downloads from universal intelligence.
Okay, I like that. Downloads from the universe. It's like we're tuning our inner radio to the right frequency.
I love that. And he has this whole process for tuning in to those downloads. First, you get really clear on the challenge. What's the issue you're dealing with? And then this is the big part. You got to detach from all the thinking about it.
Easier said than done sometimes.
Totally. But instead of getting lost in the weeds, you focus on what you want, not what you don't want.
So instead of, I don't want to be stuck in this job anymore, it's, I want a career that feels exciting and fulfilling.
Exactly. Subtle shift, but so powerful.
It's like you're changing the whole energy around it.
Yes.
Yeah.
You go from fear to possibility, and then from that more open, more aligned place, you create that space, that quiet, and allow the solution to kind of bubble up on its own.
It reminds me of that saying, let go and let God, but maybe a little less, spiritual sounding for some people.
Right.
But that allowing part, that surrender, that can be tough. Our minds, they want to be in control. So it's like we have to take this leap of faith that the answers will come if we get out of our own way.
And that's where he talks about the importance of faith, and not necessarily in a religious sense, but that deep trust in something bigger than ourselves.
Trusting that even when we can't see the path, there's something guiding us.
Exactly. We're all connected to something so much greater than our individual minds. And when we can tap into that, that's when amazing things happen.
Wow. So we've covered a lot in this deep dive. Quieting the mind, setting goals from inspiration, unconditional love, intuition, even those downloads from universal intelligence. What a journey.
It is, isn't it?
And it all comes back to that idea, don't believe everything you think.
Because we are so much more powerful than we realize.
We have everything we need within us to create incredible lives. And I think that's what I hope listeners take away from this deep dive. It's not about finding the answers somewhere out there. It's about looking within.
And remembering who you truly are.
Yes. Radiant, powerful, capable of anything.
And if you ever forget,
just remember.
Don't believe everything you think.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.